House cat rescues orphaned snow leopard until it grows bigger than foster mom. On a freezing winter afternoon, the kind that carved deep into bone and spirit alike, Elliot Carter made his way back through the narrow mountain road that twisted like a serpent through the Sierra Ridge forest. At 73, his body still remembered the rhythm of these woods, every curve, every hidden dip beneath the snow, every place where ice gathered thick enough to betray a man's footing. He'd spent 40 years as a forest ranger before retiring, and these paths were as familiar to him as the lines etched deep into his weathered palms. The wind that afternoon was merciless, howling through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human, almost pleading. Snow fell in thick curtains, the kind that erased the world and left only white silence behind. He'd been to town for his routine checkup, something his daughter insisted on from 2 states away, calling every week to make sure he'd gone, make sure he was eating properly, make sure he wasn't too lonely in that old wooden cabin he refused to leave. The doctor had given him the usual warnings about his blood pressure, about climbing ladders to clear the roof, about living alone at his age in such an isolated place. Elliot had nodded politely, the way he always did, knowing full well he'd continue exactly as he had been. The cabin wasn't just a structure of timber and nails. It was the last place he'd held his wife's hand, the last place her laughter had echoed through the rooms, the last anchor he had to a life that felt complete. The truck's heater rattled as it struggled against the cold, and Elliot pulled his thick wool coat tighter around himself. He was perhaps a mile from home when something cut through the storm's endless roar, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. He slowed the truck, rolled down the window despite the blast of frigid air, and listened. There it was again, a weak cry that didn't belong to the wind or the creaking trees. It was desperate, raw, the kind of sound that spoke of life teetering on its final edge. Without thinking, Elliot pulled the truck to the side of the road and climbed out into the storm. Snow immediately clung to his beard, his eyebrows, coating him in white within seconds. He moved toward the sound, his boots crunching through snow that reached past his ankles. The hillside here was steep and treacherous, dotted with scraggly bushes that looked like dark smudges against the white. He called out, though he didn't know what he expected to answer. The cry came again, weaker this time, and he followed it to a snow-covered bush halfway down the slope. There, huddled in a shallow depression that offered no real shelter, was a tiny creature that looked more dead than alive. A snow leopard cub, its fur matted with ice, its small body trembling so violently it seemed it might shake itself apart. The cub's eyes were barely open, clouded with cold and exhaustion. Elliot had seen death enough times in his years as a ranger to recognize it approaching. This little thing had maybe an hour left, maybe less. The mother was nowhere to be seen, likely dead, or driven off by the storm, or simply unable to find her way back through the blizzard that had descended so suddenly and with such fury. Elliot didn't hesitate. He knelt in the snow, his old knees protesting, and carefully scooped up the cub. It weighed almost nothing, all fragile bones and damp fur. He opened his coat and tucked the tiny creature inside against his chest, feeling the violent shivers, the rapid heartbeat that seemed far too fast. The cub made no sound of protest, had no energy left for fear. Elliot buttoned his coat over it, creating a warm pocket against his body. He whispered, more to himself than to the creature, "I'm not leaving you out here, kid." The words came out rough, catching in his throat in a way that surprised him. The drive home took longer than usual, the roads worse than they'd been on the way out. Elliot drove carefully, one hand on the wheel, the other pressed against his coat where the cub lay. He could feel the small body gradually warming, the shivers becoming less violent. When he finally pulled up to the cabin, night had fully fallen, and the world was nothing but darkness and swirling snow caught in the truck's headlights. Inside, the cabin was cold. He'd let the fire die down to embers before leaving, but it was shelter, and that was what mattered. Elliot moved quickly, stirring the fire back to life, adding logs until flames leaped and crackled. Only then did he carefully remove the cub from his coat. The little creature looked even more pitiful in the firelight, its gray-white fur streaked with dirt and ice, its eyes now fully closed. Elliot grabbed an old wool blanket from the closet, one his wife had made years ago, and arranged it near the fireplace. He placed the cub on it gently, then fetched a towel and began the slow work of drying the damp fur, warming the tiny frozen paws between his calloused hands. He knew he should call someone, knew there were protocols and procedures for situations like this. He reached for the phone and dialed the local wildlife rescue center, a place he'd worked with many times during his ranger years. A woman answered, her voice cheerful until she heard his situation and his location. The cheer faded quickly. The sudden storm had done more damage than anyone anticipated. The wooden bridge that provided the only vehicle access into his area had collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. They couldn't reach him, not for at least a week, maybe longer depending on how quickly repairs could be made. She apologized profusely, suggested he keep the cub warm and hydrated, warned him about the dangers of handling wild animals, and promised they'd come as soon as the bridge was fixed. When Elliot hung up, he looked down at the barely breathing creature by his fire. A week was a lifetime for something this close to death. He'd have to manage on his own. And honestly, he'd dealt with worse. He'd once set his own broken finger after a fall on a mountain trail. He'd stitched up a gash on his leg with fishing line when he was 2 days from any help. A tiny leopard cub was just another problem to solve, another life that needed tending. He made up his mind in that moment he would take care of this fragile little life, even if only for a while, even if he had no real idea what he was doing. The cub lay motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its ribs. Elliot had just turned to fetch some water when movement caught his eye. Maggie, his cream-white American Shorthair cat, had emerged from wherever she'd been sleeping. She was 12 years old, had been a gift from his wife in the months before cancer took her, and had been his only companion for the 5 years since. Maggie approached the blanket with her usual cautious curiosity, her tail raised in question. She sniffed the air, then moved closer to the cub, her pink nose twitching as she investigated this strange new presence in her home. Elliot waited for the hiss, the arched back, the territorial display that surely would come. Instead, Maggie simply sat down beside the cub and looked at it for a long moment. Then, to Elliot's amazement, she lay down, curled her body against the tiny leopard's side, and began to lick its matted fur with long, deliberate strokes. There was no aggression, no rejection, only quiet acceptance, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this strange visitor to arrive. Elliot stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. He felt something strange and powerful moving through his chest, something both soft and aching, like grief and hope tangled together. Here were 3 lonely souls in a snowy wilderness, each one lost in their own way, and somehow they'd found each other. He thought of his wife, who'd always worried he'd be too alone after she was gone, always made him promise he'd find connection, find purpose, find reasons to keep going. He'd promised, though he hadn't really believed he could keep that promise. But now, watching Maggie care for this wild creature, who by all rights should terrify her, he felt something shift inside him. He was 73 years old. He'd thought his days of caretaking were behind him, thought his role as protector had ended when his wife passed, when his daughter grew up and moved away, when he retired from the Forest Service. He'd resigned himself to a quiet fade, to becoming slowly invisible. But as he watched Maggie warm the cub, and the cub burrow instinctively against her soft belly, he knew something new was beginning. This was a family, strange and impossible, but a family nonetheless. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Elliot had barely slept, waking every hour to check on the cub, to make sure it was still breathing, to add wood to the fire. At first light, he warmed some milk, whole milk, the only kind he had, and brought it to the blanket. The cub was slightly more alert, its eyes now open and focused, though it still looked impossibly fragile. Elliot dipped his finger in the milk and tried to get the cub to lick it. Nothing. He tried a spoon, holding it carefully to the small mouth. The cub turned away, too weak or too stubborn to accept. Maggie, who'd stayed beside the cub all night, walked over to the bowl. She took a delicate sip, then turned and pushed the bowl toward the trembling creature with her nose. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that Elliot found himself smiling despite his worry. The cub watched Maggie, watched as she took another sip, then tentatively leaned forward and gave the milk a small lick. Then another. It wasn't much, barely anything, but it was enough. It was a beginning, a tiny spark of will to survive. During that first week, Elliot learned the rhythm of caring for something so young and vulnerable. Every few hours, he warmed milk, and Maggie performed her ritual of drinking first, showing the cub it was safe. The cub grew stronger slowly, painfully slowly, but it grew. Maggie never left its side for long, always returning to rest one white paw protectively on the gray-spotted body, as if to say, "This one is mine. This one is under my protection." Elliot needed a name for the creature, and the first word that came to him, sitting by the fire one evening, was Aspen. It felt right, strong but graceful, rooted but able to bend. A name that belonged to these mountains. The storm that had brought them together showed no signs of stopping. If anything, it grew stronger, more violent. Elliot spent his days stacking firewood high against the cabin wall, sealing gaps around the windows with old rags, making sure they had everything they needed to weather whatever the mountains threw at them. Inside, Aspen slept between two blankets, Maggie curled tightly beside the growing cub, her purring a constant, gentle rumble. In the evenings, Elliot poured himself tea and sat in his old rocking chair, gazing out at the endless curtain of snow that transformed the world into something alien and beautiful. One evening, as the wind screamed like a living thing around the cabin's corners, he spoke aloud to the sleeping animals. "If we make it through this winter together," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm, "then we're a family." It felt like a promise, like a vow, like something sacred being spoken into existence. Late one night, perhaps 2 weeks after Aspen's arrival, Elliot woke to a sound he'd never heard in his cabin before, a small growl, barely more than a rumble, but distinctly wild. He sat up in bed, heart racing, and saw Aspen standing on the blanket. No longer the frail, half-dead creature from the hillside. The cub was still small, still young, but there was something different in its posture, something that spoke of the predator it was always meant to become. It was making its first sound as a wild creature, testing its voice, remembering what it was. Maggie, who'd been sleeping nearby, walked over calmly. She pressed her head against Aspen's, a gesture that looked almost like a blessing, like approval. Elliot watched, understanding what was happening. Aspen needed more than warmth and milk now. It needed to learn to survive, needed to awaken the instincts that had been buried under cold and hunger and near death. It needed to remember how to be a snow leopard, not just a pet, not just a rescued animal, but something wild and capable. The next morning, Elliot bundled up and went outside into the snow. Behind the cabin, he built a simple training setup with the materials he had: a shallow pit filled with snow, a rope tied to a piece of meat he'd thawed from his freezer. It was crude, far from anything the Wildlife Center would use, but it was something. Every morning after that, he brought Aspen out for what he called their hunting game. At first, the cub just watched the meat swing, confused, but Elliot was patient, and Maggie, surprisingly, seemed to understand exactly what was needed. The cat would position herself to the side, watching Aspen's movements with keen eyes. When the cub's stance was wrong, when its crouch was too high or its approach too direct, Maggie would walk over and tap Aspen's paw with her own, a gentle correction that somehow the cub understood. Aspen would miss the target, tumble into the snow, shake itself off, and try again, and again, and slowly, over days and then weeks. Something began to awaken. The cub's movements became more fluid, more purposeful. Its eyes gained focus and intensity. The wild thing inside was stirring, remembering its inheritance. A month passed, marked by the slow retreat of the storm. The snow stopped falling with such fury. The wind lost some of its bitter edge. And one morning, Elliot heard the distant sound of machinery road crews working to build a temporary bridge. Within days, a truck from the Wildlife Rescue Center made its way up the mountain road. Two young staffers, bundled in bright orange coats, knocked on his door. They were kind and professional, explaining that Aspen needed proper care now, needed to be with its own kind, needed to be prepared for eventual release into the wild. Everything they said made sense. Everything they said was right. But when the day of farewell came, When Elliot wrapped Aspen in that old wool blanket one last time and held the cub tight against his chest, his eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. Aspen made a sound, almost questioning, pressing its face into his neck. Maggie sat on the bed, perfectly still, watching. She didn't approach, didn't say goodbye in her usual affectionate way. She simply watched, as if she understood this was an ending she needed to witness but couldn't participate in. The rescue truck disappeared behind the pine ridge, red taillights swallowing by the trees. Elliot stood in the snow for a long time after, clutching his coat, feeling emptiness spread through his chest like frost. The cabin, when he finally went back inside, felt cavernous. Maggie had retreated to the bedroom and wouldn't come out, not even for food. The wool blanket still lay by the fireplace, marked with the shape of a small body that was no longer there. Days passed in heavy silence. Elliot tried to return to his routines, but everything felt hollow. He'd cut wood without thinking about what he was doing. He'd make tea and forget to drink it. Maggie moved through the cabin like a ghost, occasionally sitting by the window, staring out as if waiting for something to return. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, Elliot's phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to the center's director, a woman named Sarah, who'd always struck him as sensible and compassionate. Her voice was strained with worry. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we need to talk about Aspen." The snow leopard, she explained, had stopped responding to everything. It wouldn't eat, wouldn't play, wouldn't engage with any of the enrichment activities they provided. It just lay in the corner of its enclosure, staring at nothing, occasionally curling up on a piece of cloth that one of the staff had placed there. They tried everything: new diets, calming music, toys, different enclosures, but nothing worked. The cub was fading, losing weight, losing the spark of life that had finally returned in Elliot's cabin. "Sir," Sarah said, and he could hear the defeat in her voice. "It's fading fast. We don't know what else to do." Elliot didn't think, didn't consider, didn't hesitate. "I'm coming," he said simply, and hung up. He packed a small bag with a few changes of clothes, his medications, some books. He filled a carrier with Maggie's things, her food, her favorite blanket, the toy mouse she'd had since she was a kitten. Maggie seemed to understand something was happening. And for the first time in days, there was alertness in her eyes, almost like hope. They drove to the center, a 2-hour journey over mountain roads that were still treacherous with ice. The center was a sprawling facility with multiple buildings and large outdoor enclosures designed to mimic natural habitats. Sarah met them at the entrance, her face etched with concern and something else: skepticism. Maybe, or worry that they were about to witness something heartbreaking. She led Elliot and Maggie to Aspen's enclosure, a spacious area with rocks and logs and a heated shelter. In the far corner, barely visible, was a small gray shape curled into itself. "Aspen," Elliot called out, his voice rough. The effect was immediate and staggering. The cub's head snapped up. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Aspen bolted upright and sprinted across the enclosure with a speed that made Sarah take a startled step back. The young leopard leaped at the fence, climbed halfway up it, and made a sound: not a growl, not a roar, but something heartbreakingly close to a kitten's mew. Elliot dropped to his knees, pressing his hand against the fence. Aspen pressed its face against his palm through the chain link, its whole body vibrating with emotion. Then Elliot opened Maggie's carrier. The white cat emerged cautiously, taking in her surroundings, and then she saw Aspen. She walked to the fence, sat down, and touched her nose to the leopard's nose through the links. Aspen made that soft crying sound again. Tried to push through the fence, tried to reach Maggie. The staff stood silent, watching. Several of them had tears in their eyes. Sarah's hand was pressed against her mouth. "In 15 years of working here," she whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." There was no other choice, no other path that made any sense. Elliot asked if he could stay at the center, and Sarah, after a quick conversation with her colleagues, offered him a small room adjacent to Aspen's enclosure. It wasn't much, just a bed, a small desk, a bathroom, but it was enough. Elliot moved in that same day. He set up his few belongings, hung his old ranger jacket on a hook, and in one corner, he recreated the setup from his cabin as best he could, a blanket on the floor, a space where Maggie could sleep, and just beyond the wall, separated only by chain link and glass, Aspen's enclosure. From that day forward, a new routine established itself. Every morning, Elliot would wake early, brew tea on the small hot plate Sarah provided, and settle into a chair outside Aspen's enclosure. Maggie, granted special permission to enter the outdoor portion of the leopard's space, would slip through a small access door and walk over to Aspen. The leopard, now growing stronger, would lower its head, and Maggie would bump her forehead against it, grooming the wild creature as she'd done when it was barely alive on a cabin floor. And the three of them would sit together, just as they had during that long winter, connected by something that had no name but was stronger than any chain link. Elliot read aloud old novels, poetry, sections from ranger manuals that Aspen couldn't possibly understand but seemed to find soothing. He told stories about the forest, about his years as a ranger, about his wife and the life they'd built together. He taught Aspen an advanced version of their stalking game, with Sarah's permission, helping the young leopard hone the instincts it would need. And every evening, without fail, he read a particular poem, the one his late wife had loved, about mountains and home and the wild spaces where the soul finds rest. One night, Aspen had a nightmare. Elliot woke to the sound of thrashing, of distressed growls that cut through the darkness. He rushed to the glass, saw the leopard convulsing in sleep, fighting invisible demons. Maggie was already inside the enclosure, having pushed through her access door. She rushed to Aspen's side, curled against the larger animal's body. Elliot sat down outside the enclosure and began to read the poem, his voice low and steady, cutting through panic with calm, slowly, painfully slowly. Aspen's breathing evened. The thrashing stopped. The leopard's eyes opened, found Elliot through the glass, found Maggie beside its body, and slowly closed again in peaceful sleep. From that night forward, the bedtime reading became non-negotiable, a ritual that held their small family together. Aspen continued training, working with the center's specialist to prepare for eventual release. The leopard learned to hunt live prey, learned to navigate complex terrain, learned all the skills that would keep it alive in the wild. But after every session, no matter how intense, Aspen would return to the home enclosure and rest beside Maggie, or press its head against the glass where Elliot sat, or nuzzle the old man's hand when he was allowed inside for cleaning and enrichment. People said the leopard was too soft-hearted to survive in the wild, said all this human contact had ruined it. But Elliot would shake his head and reply, "It just has a heart bigger than most. That doesn't make it weak." Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to wishes and wants. Aspen grew from a fragile cub into a young, powerful snow leopard. Each stride carried power and grace. Muscles moved beneath spotted fur like water flowing. Eyes that had once been clouded with near death now gleamed with intelligence and wildfire. But no matter how large Aspen became, how strong and capable, every time Elliot sat down, the leopard would press its massive head against his hand, seeking the connection that had saved its life. One quiet afternoon, while Elliot was reading in his chair, he called out softly, "Aspen." The leopard's head turned instantly, ears forward, eyes locked on him. It trotted over and pressed against the glass, making that soft sound that was somehow both a purr and a growl. Elliot smiled. "You know your name, don't you? You know who gave it to you." Aspen's tail swished once, a confirmation, an acknowledgement of everything that bound them. The veterinary staff marveled at how gentle Aspen was during examinations. The leopard would lie down calmly, allow blood draws and temperature checks, submit to handling without the sedation usually required for wild animals. The vets would look at Elliot in amazement. He would only smile and say, "It's used to hands that know how to care." One evening, sitting outside Aspen's enclosure with Maggie in his lap and the leopard lounging on the other side of the glass, Elliot spoke about his wife. He didn't often talk about her, found it too painful. But something about the approaching winter made him need to say her name aloud. "She always feared I'd be lonely," he whispered, his voice cracking. Always worried about what would happen to me after she was gone. But then, you two showed up. Aspen walked over, pressing its face against the glass at the exact spot where Elliot's lap was. Maggie purred louder, kneading his leg with her paws. No words were needed, just presence, just love that transcended species and logic. Another storm arrived, nearly a year after the first one that had changed everything. This time, Aspen didn't hide or seek comfort. Instead, the leopard lay across the entrance to Elliot's room, eyes open and watchful through the night, a guardian protecting its family. In the morning, a staff member found them like that and quietly snapped a photo of a snow leopard lying peacefully, protecting the door of an old man's room. The photo went up on the staff bulletin board with no caption. None was needed. But Elliot knew, in the way that people know things they wish weren't true, that the final farewell was approaching. Aspen was 2 years old now, fully grown, fully capable. The center's board of directors met and reviewed the leopard's progress. The decision was unanimous. Aspen was ready to return to the wild. Sarah came to tell Elliot personally, sitting with him in his small room, holding his weathered hand. "You've given this animal everything," she said gently. "You've given it life and love and the skills to survive. Now you have to give it freedom." He knew she was right. He said nothing for a long time, just nodded slowly. When the day came, he didn't cry or protest. He simply knelt in Aspen's enclosure and then hugged the massive leopard tight, feeling its heartbeat against his chest, memorizing the feel of its fur, the warmth of its body, the sound of its breathing. Maggie circled them both, licking Aspen's forehead one last time. A benediction, a goodbye, a blessing for the road ahead. Aspen didn't growl or resist. It simply looked at them both for a long, quiet moment, its golden eyes holding everything that couldn't be said. On release day, Elliot didn't follow the transport truck into the deep forest. He couldn't bear to watch Aspen walk away, couldn't stand to see the moment of separation. Instead, he stood at the forest edge near the center, holding the old wool blanket that still smelled faintly of cabin smoke and cat and leopard. The staff opened the crate in a remote valley, far from roads and people, in the heart of Aspen's natural territory. The leopard stepped out slowly, testing the ground, tasting the air. It turned back once, looked at the humans watching from a distance, and for just a moment, it seemed to be searching for one particular face. Then it turned and ran into the forest, disappearing into the gray-green shadows, leaving nothing behind but paw prints in thin snow. The cabin on the hillside, which Elliot returned to after Aspen's release, felt haunted by absence. He and Maggie moved through rooms that echoed, sat by a fireplace that seemed too large, slept in a bed that felt emptier than it had even after his wife died. But one snowy morning, weeks after the release, Maggie began scratching at the window in her urgent way. Elliot looked up from his tea and saw a familiar silhouette across the woods, a large snow leopard, standing perfectly still on a distant ridge, its spotted coat almost invisible against the snow-covered rocks. But Elliot knew that shape, knew the way it held its head, knew in his bones that this was Aspen. He didn't open the door, didn't call out, didn't try to make contact. That wasn't his role anymore. Instead, he simply raised his hand in greeting, a small wave across the distance. The leopard Aspen bowed its head once, a gesture that looked impossibly deliberate, and then turned and vanished into the misty woods like smoke dissipating. Not long after, a village boy came by the cabin selling firewood with his father. The boy was wide-eyed and excited, talking about a huge leopard he'd seen. "It wasn't afraid," the boy insisted, "just stood there on the ridge, watching this cabin, like it missed someone." Elliot listened, thanked them for the wood, and after they left, he placed a large bowl of fresh water in the old cloth that Aspen had slept on outside by the porch. "In case it ever comes by again," he said to Maggie, who sat in the window, watching. The next morning, Elliot found evidence in the snow by his porch, a large circular imprint where something heavy had lain for a long time. The snow there was compressed, melted slightly by body heat, ringed by paw prints that could only belong to one animal. Maggie walked outside, touched her pink nose to the impression, and then curled up in that exact spot, as if trying to maintain a connection. Elliot knelt beside her, his old knees protesting, and ran his hand through the depression. "It still remembers home," he whispered. "It still knows where love lives." Time continued its patient march. Seasons changed. Snow melted into spring. Spring bloomed into summer. Summer faded into autumn. The cabin was quieter now. But it wasn't lonely, not truly. In Elliot's heart, and in the occasional signs left in snow, or the rare sighting on a distant ridge, love still lived as if it had never left. Aspen roamed free among the mountains, a wild creature living the life it was born for, hunting and surviving and thriving. But somewhere inside that powerful predator was a memory of warmth, of a wool blanket by a fire, of a white cat's gentle grooming, of an old man's weathered hands and steady voice, a memory of home. Because Aspen carried that home within its heart, a home without walls, built by three unlikely souls who'd been bound together by one unforgiving winter. A home constructed not of timber and stone, but of care and presence, and the fierce determination to protect something fragile and make it strong. And Elliot Carter, sitting in his rocking chair as another winter approached, understood something his wife had tried to tell him in those final days before cancer took her. Family isn't where you're born. Family isn't defined by blood or species or logic. Family is where you're loved beyond measure, beyond reason, beyond the boundaries that supposedly separate one kind of heart from another. He'd found that family in the most impossible of places, and though they no longer shared the same space, they would always share the same sky, the same mountains, the same snow that fell equally on cabin and wilderness alike. Outside, the first flakes of the season began to fall, and somewhere in the vast Sierra Ridge forest, a snow leopard lifted its face to the sky and remembered. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.